Buddhism is particularly sort of concerned with transformation. It's not particularly concerned with sort of describing the human situation for the sake of describing the human situation. It's really concerned to transform, and particularly to point the way to transformation. Okay. So welcome back everybody, and welcome especially to the people who are here for the first time. My name's Amalayodhin, and I've been invited, very generously invited by Amarapuspa and Maitranara and Viranaga to come down and have, just do a couple of evenings with you here over 2 weeks. And so I was here last week and I'll be here this week again. And we've been looking at a few different things. Last week we were looking at the whole sort of cosmology, the whole kind of Buddhist universe that existed in the Buddhist time, but then sort of was elaborated on later on by sort of later Buddhist schools, and we sort of saw that they were kind of like really kind of rich, magical sort of places, that there were, loads of heavens and hells and different worlds and pixies and hobgoblins and gods and all of these sort of really interesting creatures. So that was last week. And this week, what we're going to talk a little bit about, and then myself and Amarapuspa will have a bit of a discussion on, is because one of the things that we were looking at last week was the human situation within that great big sort of Buddhist cosmology, like where do human beings sort of fit into that particular sort of view of looking at the world. And this week I'm going to look a bit about, because we started a bit on it last week, this whole idea of vision and transformation. So Buddhism is particularly sort of concerned with transformation. It's not particularly concerned with sort of describing the human situation for the sake of describing the human situation. It's really concerned to transform, and particularly to point the way to transformation. Actually, the vision bit is quite easy. I think most of us will have at one point or a time or another have had a vision as to our lives having a bit more kind of potential. In fact, our lives as human beings have a bit more potential than we have actually sort of maybe thought of so far. Sometimes those can be kind of great big openings, can't they? Sort of like, I don't know, maybe we've had a particularly intense experience or something like that, or maybe we've dropped a load of acid, or maybe we've done whatever, and we've had this sort of great big kind of like window open into consciousness that is radically different from what we previously had sort of imagined. But even if we sort of haven't had one of those kind of great big massive windows into something that's very, very new to us and sort of exciting to us, I think often we have these I think most of us will be able to relate in some small way. We go traveling, for example, as young people, and we sort of have a whole different way of life sort of opened up to us very briefly. Or we go out into the countryside and we have a walk, and all of a sudden kind of the world just sort of opens up a little bit. I think most of us have had that sort of experience. Or all of a sudden we're in a conversation with a friend, and something in terms of the walls between you and the friend just sort of drops away. All of a sudden you're in a much more kind of direct communication, and you're kind of almost inhabiting a kind of single mind in some way. Sometimes this can happen in sports, or it can happen maybe some of us are watching the Euros at the moment, and the way teams can just all of a sudden just start to inhabit a kind of single mind. So sometimes that will happen to us, won't it? And it kind of on the bigger or the smaller scales. But Buddhism, while it says, okay, that's good to have those little windows into that, it's really concerned with transformation, really concerned with getting us then. Because quite often when those experiences finish, we fall back into, the people we are. That, with all our complications and difficulties and reactions and crankinesses and all the rest of it, we fall back into that. Sometimes we think, there's no way we'll ever go back to being the same, having seen what I've seen or sort of experienced what I've experienced now. But unfortunately we do. tragic as it is, but we do. So the Buddha and Buddhism has always really been concerned primarily with this aspect of transforming, and that's where really the hard work comes in. And it's not work of weeks or months. It's years and decades, and even according to the Buddha, lifetimes as well. That whole transformation from an unenlightened being who's first come across the path to enlightenment, and then to enlightenment takes, according to the Buddha, sometimes lifetimes. So yeah, it's a big task, that whole aspect of transformation, and anybody that's tried to do it will know that as well. It takes time. It takes a lot of time actually to change sometimes, and sometimes we can change quite radically as to where we are now, but in terms of this overarching kind of goal, it takes a long time. So there's this whole sort of teaching. There's these 12 stages of transformation that you get for the Buddha. He called it the 12 positive nidanas, and it's basically a sort of roadmap to transformation. So when this happens, then this happens, and then that happens, and then this happens, and it's a whole kind of set out path to transforming ultimately to being an enlightened being, a Buddha itself. So the Buddha felt that all human beings had the capacity for enlightenment, and in that sense to become Buddhas. And he sort of mapped out that path to people. And there's this whole big sort of 12 series to it. Now, I'm not going to go through the 12 of them because, it gets to 4 and it starts to get pretty out there, and pretty trippy. So I'm going to start with the first 2 and basically say a little bit about the first 2. And the first 2 are on the basis of dukkha, or on the basis of unsatisfactoriness, arises shraddha, or arises faith. So on the basis of dukkha arises shraddha, or on the basis of suffering or unsatisfactoriness arises faith. So that's the sort of the first 2. So yeah, just to say a bit about, keep my eye on my watch, otherwise I'll go over. So just to say a little bit about the, firstly on dukkha. So what is dukkha? So dukkha is often translated as suffering, and one of the Buddha's first noble truths, that is all unenlightened human experience is dukkha, or is unsatisfactory. So, which isn't to say that life as an unenlightened human being is always bleak. That's definitely not what the Buddha is saying. In fact, if you go to sort of Buddhist countries, they can often be quite a bit more sort of sunny and positive and sort of outward going than non-Buddhist countries. But there's this foundational teaching at the heart of Buddhism that says all unenlightened experience is unsatisfactory. And often the metaphor that's given for this unsatisfactoriness is like an ill-fitting wheel on a cart. So when the Buddha was around, people would have moved around by cart. And you could imagine an ill-fitting wheel on a cart, couldn't you? It would be a bit unsatisfactory, wouldn't it? The ride would be a bit bumpy the whole way. So that's the way that the Buddha sort of related to unenlightened experience. It was like, it can be, sometimes it does involve very strong levels of suffering. But really what the Buddha was pointing to with this unsatisfactoriness, or dukkha, is something that just doesn't quite work. Even when it's going really well, it doesn't quite work. There's sort of something that's always missing, or a bit kind of a bit bumpy, or a bit not quite sort of there. So that's what the Buddha would say about unenlightened experience, particularly in relation to enlightened experience as well. So it's relational in that sense. So yeah, you could call it as well as sort of constriction. Dukkha, this unsatisfactoriness, I think one way of thinking about it is, you take something actually with a potential for infinitude, for being totally vast, unlimited, which is the human mind, and you squeeze it into something quite small. Usually we squeeze it into, when we're unenlightened, we squeeze it into a sort of self. And that self is all our kind of habits and our tendencies and our reactions and our responses. And the things that we identify with and then the things that we disidentify with, which of course creates quite a small world for us, doesn't it? Our sort of opinions, our preferences, our reactions, and again, what we identify with, and then on that basis, what we disidentify with. What we're left with is something quite small in comparison to the mind when in its enlightened state, which doesn't identify with any particular thing at all, which is totally open and totally in connection with all things. What we're left with is something sort of quite constricted. So you could think of dukkha or unsatisfactoriness as the constriction of this thing, our mind, which is infinite in potential, into something which is quite small and quite sort of cramped, which is our usual kind of everyday way of being with the world and relating to the world. It's on the basis of me. We all do that, I do that, on the basis of kind of relating to what do I get from this? How can I further myself? It's a very natural thing for human beings to do, to think of things always from the perspective of self. And that's constricting. It causes sort of unsatisfactoriness or suffering. So that's this idea of dukkha. And then so on the basis of that arises Shraddha. And Shraddha being sort of translated as faith. And what's meant by Shraddha here is not faith in the same sort of way that's usually talked about in the theistic tradition, so say Christianity, which is a sort of faith, sometimes a blind faith, in a sort of creator God, or an idea that, something along those lines, which can't actually be proved or is very hard to prove. And so you're sort of, the understanding is that you sort of accept it on blind faith. And Buddhism isn't talking about that. It's talking about something actually that you can test. So it's particularly faith in the Buddha's path and faith in, the Buddha's enlightenment as well. That actually this state beyond this sort of constricted self that we build for ourselves is actually possible. And the Buddha achieved it, and we can achieve it too if we sort of go in that direction, if we take steps in that direction. So it's faith in an enlightened state, in a liberated state, and a faith in the Buddha's teachings as to how to get there. That's what is meant by it. And it's often said to have kind of three different aspects. Faith of the head, which is like a sort of cognitive or an intellectual belief in what the Buddha has talked about, so that all things are impermanent, all things are empty, which is to say they don't have an essence or a self to them, and all things are unsatisfactory. So a sort of intellectual sort of belief in that, a faith in it in that sense. So that's described as faith as the head. Then there's faith of the heart, which is sort of like a kind of emotional resonance with something of enlightenment or something of beyond our sort of normal day-to-day states, as something that's sort of transcendent or something that's divine. So this faith can sort of be talked about as a kind of like, I suppose, a heart connection with something. So sometimes people, for example, they come in and they see the image of the Buddha. I have a friend that did this. They went to Sri Lanka and they saw a Buddha statue in Kandy, and he just knew he was a Buddhist on that basis. He just saw the image and he knew he was a Buddhist. So it was that level of faith arising from sort of a kind of heart connection with an image. That's also a level of Shraddha, of faith as well. So you've got these two aspects of faith, the faith of the head and the faith of the heart. And so in this first sort of stage, unsatisfactoriness is said to give rise to faith. Faith of the heart, faith of the mind, faith of the head. I've always been really interested as to sort of why that is. I've not quite known, actually. I mean, like, people sort of say it. People say it in Buddhist circles. They go on the basis of dukkha arises Shraddha, or on the basis of unsatisfactoriness arises faith. But I sort of wonder why. I mean, it's not like, it's true, there's truth to it. Sometimes it's not always true, is it? I mean, you can have an experience of suffering and actually it doesn't give rise to faith at all. It gives rise to despondency and despair and all of those sorts of things. but on the basis of an experience of unsatisfactoriness arises faith. And I've sort of wondered why that is. And I mean, I've been giving it a bit of thought in relation to this particular talk. And I mean, I think one aspect of it is that, you know, whenever we feel unsatisfactoriness, particularly when we feel the constriction of our lives or the sort of boringness of our kind of mundane lives at times, you know, there can be a feeling like there must be more to it than this. There must be a way out of this. It can't be that the human sort of state is so broken at times that like there's not a way out, or there's not more than this. You know, I was watching that movie recently again, actually, called Boyhood. I don't know if people have seen it. Is it Linklater is the director? I think it might be. Fantastic movie, absolutely brilliant movie. Nothing happens in it. It's, you know, it's just a coming of age film. Nothing happens in it, but it's great. It's really great. And the mum, towards the end of the movie, when the kids have grown up and she sent her son off to university, and like she gets to, I think she's this amazing scene where she sits in the apartment and she's like, "Is this it? You know, I've done all of this. You know, I've worked hard. I've had kids. I've brought them up. You know, I've done all the right things. I've got the house, everything like that. I've done everything I've been asked of. Is this it?" And so I think that's sort of the experience that the Buddha might be pointing to in this, like, you know, this sort of, we're sold a certain kind of thing of how to do a human life. And even when we do it really well sometimes, we can just go, "God, is this it? You know, is there not something a bit more to it than that?" We can find ourselves kind of bored and stuck. So I think that's the sort of thing that the Buddha was pointing to when he was talking about dukkha giving rise to Shraddha. Because as soon as you have this sort of question mark of, is this it? It can lead to a sense of searching for something beyond those sort of mundane states, but also a kind of resonance that it isn't. You know, there's a sort of sense that there's more to it in that particular moment. And then that's a sort of kind of intuition. You know, we can have a faith of as a sort of intuition then. So, you know, I think so often our capacity for that intuition has to be sort of built a little bit, has to be kind of like a faculty has to be kind of trained in us in that extent. You know, and particularly sort of noticing where there is something more there, particularly coming into communication where there's something more there. You know, it might be something like, you know, a really beautiful sunset, or nature or beauty so often does it, doesn't it? So yeah, I don't have a whole lot more to say on that, actually, just in this, like, it's interesting that from this starting point of unsatisfactoriness arises the whole path. That starting point of like, oh God, this is so constricted or so sort of mundane. There must be something more than that. And on that basis can arise faith that there is something more than that. And actually, really, the rest of the Buddhist path is then undertaken on the basis of faith. If we have faith that there is something more, that there is something sort of transcendent, the whole of the rest of the path then unfolds for us, if we follow it sort of diligently. But it all arises from that experience of there must be something more. And then a sort of intuition that, well, maybe, you know, the image of the Buddha sat in meditation, that might be it. That sort of heart resonance with that. It's really interesting, actually, and I'll finish up on this point because I've gone over time again. But when I first started coming to the Buddhist Centre, I came in Dublin. I first started coming to the Dublin Buddhist Centre, and I was such a reluctant Buddhist. I was like, there was some part of me that was totally sort of hooked, and kept on turning up each week, and the rest of me that was like, what is all this about? Like, you know, really, kind of, are we going here again? Really? We're meditating again? Really? You know, we're doing all of this again. And yeah, I think there was that small little aspect of me that intuited that there was something much more to it. So yeah, and I think that particularly with me and for so many people sort of arose from an experience of unsatisfactoriness with what I had, with what was there. So I'll leave it at that. I've gone way over time again, but hopefully I'll be forgiven. So yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you, Amalayodhin, it's quite a grand topic, this path, this, that has, well, it's one formulation, doesn't it? It has 12 stages, but like you, I find the first 2 stages fascinating, this dukkha, and then a basis on dukkha, faith arises. But it's interesting, my sense of the way you describe dukkha is the existential kind of suffering that we have. But we also have all sorts of other kinds of suffering, don't we? We have people who have serious bereavements, for example, or lose career or illness, and I think sometimes that can, along with that existential dukkha, I think it's a motivator, don't you? Like I think when things are going peachy keen in our life, I know I get a bit complacent and not really motivated to reflect and look on my life. But I know for me it was kind of a crisis that made me, it wasn't just the existential, is this all there is? It was more, I've been going around in circles. There must be another, how do I get out of this repeating the habits, etc. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, no, it was very similar to me as well. I mean, I've talked more about the existential side as well, but I mean, we mentioned it last week in these various sort of realms that you have, and there's more potential in the teaching of the sort of 6 realms. There's said to be more potential in the hell realm than there is in the God realm, and I think it's for this reason. It's like sometimes when we hit total crisis, we have to sort of find a completely different way of doing it.
Yeah.
It's like, and I did this as well. I mean, like I had quite a strong experience of depression in my late teens and early 20s, and it was like, I just had to try and find a different way. It was like the kind of the manual didn't seem to work. So I had to sort of think of something completely outside of, the usual sort of things you try, which would be, which I suppose growing up in university in Ireland was, go out, drink a bit more, party a bit more, all of those things.
I'm sure you're not alone. So it's almost like it's a bit of a shock. I mean, that was my experience, that kind of heading in a certain direction with certain views of, if I reach for this and reach for that, everything's going to be happily ever after. So yeah, I think that's a great motivator. But it's interesting about this faith arising, because I have a different interpretation. I think for me the subtext of going from suffering to faith is that we're practicing. So we're practicing, the threefold way, which is ethics. We're looking at our ethics. We're meditating. We're reflecting on the teaching. And based on that, our suffering decreases and we become happier. And because of that, I mean, that's my experience. Because of that, I thought, gosh, this really works. I am happier. This really, and that's where, to me, the faith comes in. So to me, it makes sense. If you just take it going from suffering to faith, but that subtext is that we're practicing and
And of course, that's really important, that particular, that confident, that faith in the sense of confidence in something. And it's a bit like, okay, I put this into practice and it works. And then you just, okay, let's keep on going in that direction. And particularly, I think if you've come from a sort of crisis as well, there's a lot of motivation not to go back there. It's really like, if you've had something like that, extreme, like a very strong experience of suffering in your life, it can be a really strong motivator to go, okay, well, I'm not going back there. So
no, and it's kind of a relief that you found a different, kind of a release from going around in circles. I mean, this path is known as a spiral. I quite like the geometric kind of imagery that goes with it. We have the Wheel of Life a couple of weeks ago, where you just keep going round and round, and then we have this way of getting off the wheel, this spiral. And then based on faith, joy arises. That's the third step. And I think the three of them really. So you got faith sandwiched in between suffering and joy, you know. And it's kind of, you're just kind of relieved that, oh, actually there is a way out. There is.
But it is, that third step, I think, is very important as well. I didn't bring it in just for time reasons today, but I think you know, it's really important actually, because one of the most, you know, satisfying things I've got out of the path is just this joy that I do actually have a sense of particular direction in my life, and there is something that I can rely on and fall back on and you know, progress in as well. And that's such a relief. It's so joyful. I sort of think, you know, and there was a long time in my life where I was totally lost, you know, like completely like directionless, and it's quite a despair sort of being in that state as well, you know. And that doesn't mean that necessarily direction has to come from the Buddhist path as well. People can get a sense of direction in lots of different areas, but I've found the absence of that, it can be so traumatic in a sense, in a way. And I think, you know, we see it more and more actually around us. You know, look at the issues related to mental health and suicide and all of those things, and so often I think it's related to just a certain sort of directionless in life. I think, you know, I think it's going back to the existential suffering. You know, I think, I that's the way I felt, that what a suffering is to feel life doesn't have meaning, you know. And for me that was the greatest joy, is to find something so deeply meaningful. Besides the kind of side effects of just generally finding conditions that made other just everyday things happier, running more smoothly, or you know. But the that meaning was very very important to me. And of course with that meaning, particularly in the Buddhist sense, you can put all of yourself into that as well, can't you? And it's like, well, so often the things that it was like, you know, I found meaning in various different parts of my life coming up to finding Buddhism, and it was, you know, sport, or it was politics at one point, you know, all of those things. And it was like all of those things couldn't quite get enough of me in. It didn't demand very much of me in a certain extent, like, you know, the sporting side. Well, eventually I got injured actually, so that was that, but also it didn't demand very much of me emotionally, say, for example, or it didn't demand very much of me in terms of maturing. So, you know, it gave meaning, it definitely gave meaning, and actually I was very thankful for it as well at the time. But it never sort of resonated with the whole of me, and it was never going to demand of me to grow into a really kind of mature human being in a certain way. I think similar to you, I found things that were somewhat meaningful, but there was something, well, I guess the Buddha would say, you know, unless we're enlightened, you know, life dependent on conditions, which is our mundane life. We're dependent, you know, everything is change and impermanence, and we're looking for satisfaction in something that's constantly changing and can't satisfy us, you know. So unless we, you know, and I was looking for it in career and marriage, and, you know, I just had this timeline of tick, tick, tick. And then, you know, I just fell flat on my face. And and I remember picking myself up and thought, all that really matters to me is kindness. And then there was something very strong in Buddhism about kindness, actually, when I did come across it. And the Buddha was particularly known for kindness, but of a level, like an enlightened kindness that is, I just found so inspiring. Well, it's amazing, isn't it? You can go, because to the extent that you have faith in that as well, it's such a strong sort of reliable thing that we can fall back on, actually, that we have ultimately, even with all the transiency. I mean, it's interesting, I was back in my hometown, Kinsale, where I grew up last weekend in Ireland, and I have this very sort of nostalgic kind of relationship with the place that I grew up. I'm very lucky I grew up in a really beautiful part of Ireland by the sea. But it's totally changed. You know, it's not the same place that I grew up anymore, and it doesn't know me anymore either. It's like I'm sort of I'm sort of alien to the place now at this point. You know, it's like,
yes.
And so that kind of yearning nostalgia that I have for it, you know, it's not particularly reliable, but actually, you know, things like love and friendship and kindness and courage and generosity and all patience, all of those things, they're always there all the time.
Yeah.
And I can always rely on them.
Yeah,
actually.
those are, yeah, that is, yeah, it's beyond time. And that's what we take refuge in Buddhism, is what isn't subject to that change, what isn't subject to impermanence and insubstantial. And that's what the Buddha stands for us. Yeah. So maybe we'll wrap it up there.
Great, so I hope you enjoyed that Dharma Night talk. So if you did enjoy it, if you're enjoying our videos, I just want to ask you or encourage you to think about making a donation to the Brixton Buddhist community. We're a UK charity that relies completely on your donations to run everything here. And if this was a class, a meditation class, there'd be a donation bowl that you could just put in £10 at the end of the night to help support the activities. But as you're watching this online, I just want to ask you to think about making an online donation. If you've watched 4 or 5 videos this month, maybe you might want to think about giving £10. So there's a link in the description below where you can go to our website and make a donation. And if you want to keep giving, you don't want to worry about making that donation every month, well, you could just set up a standing order, a monthly standing order. That would be really, really helpful. I want to suggest something of the region of maybe £10 or £20 a month if you're able to do that. And that would be really, really helpful and help us keep producing videos like this one. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourself.